A fierce tropical storm was raging. These tropical storms used to petrify me at the age of 10. And on this particular occasion, I can remember just as distinctly as if it happened yesterday. The trees were leaning low with a fierce wind. Torrents of rain were gushing out of the heavens. I was in the bedroom right close to my mother. But when a particularly blinding flash of lightning followed immediately with a terrible cannon booming of the thunder, shook me away from my mother, and I ran into the living room looking for help, for shelter, for protection. And as I ran into the living room, I saw my father standing there looking out of the window, totally unperturbed. And as I reached up eagerly to grasp his hand, he clasped it in both of his. He knew how I felt on such occasions. And because of the roar of the tempest, he had to lean way over as he said to me, "Sonny, our Father in heaven has sent his angels to be with us. Everything will be all right." The ministry of these heavenly beings has been a tremendous encouragement and a sustaining power to me in my ministry. And I thought this morning that I would like to share with you a few experiences, as time will permit, of the wonderful ministration and the power of a single angel. Many times I like to make the comparison and spend an hour perhaps of studying together the comparison between these mighty angels of God and the work of their counterpart, the also mighty but destructive ministers of the devil, as I have seen them both working in various forms out in heathen Africa. But this morning we'll concentrate on the wonderful ministry of angels. And as we realize more distinctly what the ministering of angels has to do in your life and in my life, I'm sure it will encourage us and help us to always bear in mind that our dear Father in heaven has sent his angels and everything will be all right. I think this is the latest book that our General Conference President has printed. It is called The Angels Over Elizabethville. A few weeks ago when I came through Washington, Elder Pearson autographed this particular copy, having come from the big sticks and bushes of Central Africa, East Africa. I hadn't even seen that this book had been written yet. He autographed it and handed it to me and reminded me a little bit of the times we spent together on this particular experience. But right at the beginning, he begins his book with this quotation from My Life Today, page 367. "Not until the providences of God are seen in the light of eternity shall we understand fully what we owe to the care and interposition of his angels." One text that I can remember having learned as a child, perhaps the very first text that I learned to commit to memory as a small child, was Psalms 34 verse 7. We all know it. "The angel of the Lord encampeth around about them that fear him, and delivereth them." What a privilege to work for a God, to serve a God who is so interested in the minute details of our lives that, as we read again in Great Controversy, page 512, a guardian angel is appointed to every follower of Christ. We know that. We've read this statement. We know we have our guardian angels, but if we really and truly understood what that meant, wouldn't our lives be a shade different than they are? Wouldn't our daily routine in the performance of our assigned responsibilities be considerably different, perhaps, than they are? Our associations in the home, with our fellow workers, with our neighbor, wouldn't we act just a little bit differently if we really understood that an angel of God, a guardian angel, this one that has been appointed to every follower of Christ, that he is there, he is with us. He is there not only to protect, which is a wonderfully encouraging thought, to protect us sometimes from dangers seen and many times from dangers unseen, but if we could bear in mind that he is also the recording angel. We are told that every word that man shall speak, he will have to give an account for in the day of judgment. How does that guardian angel record every word? Is it an old feather cut into the point, which he dips into unseen ink and now and again records what we do, as we often seen pictured in some pictures? Is it perhaps a tape recorder that he carries around, sends up to those files in the books of heaven? But the ministry of angels is a wonderful study. And as I share with you one or two experiences of what this ministry of the angels has meant to me, I hope and pray that your faith will be strengthened in the love of a God, in the love of Jesus, as we heard in the story told to the children this morning. That love which we so often possibly not spurn, but do not fully appreciate. I have heard the voice of my guardian angel. I will not give the details of the experience, but I'll never forget when I heard the voice of that guardian angel. The wars were swinging back and forth in the Katanga at the same time that this experience that Elder Pearson records in Angels Over Elizabethville was written. Tribes were fighting between themselves. We had thousands. At one time, our church, we were responsible for 600,000 refugees. The forces of the United Nations who were sent there to maintain peace and to try and organize some semblance of order were the very troops that armed the opposing tribes and caused the greatest destruction that the Katanga has ever seen. So the refugees were in many different groups around the country. We had been asked by President Chombe to supervise the distribution of American foodstuffs, surplus, coming from the government under a Title III program of USAID. We were given many cases of medicines from the World Health Organization. Our own Dorcas Society, through a general conference from Watsonville and from Washington, were sending out trainloads of clothing. These medicines had to be delivered. I had gone up to Kolwezi to get into an airplane to deliver a ton of these medicines. A brand new airplane had been placed at my disposition. The medicines had been loaded, the cases carefully stacked and strapped into the Dove de Havilland. Early that morning, the major in charge of the Air Force was standing beside me, said, "Everything's ready, Reverend Robinson." And as I put my foot onto the little step that led up to enter this aircraft, the voice, just as distinctly as you're hearing my voice this morning, told me, no, do not fly in that airplane. I obeyed. Another aircraft was provided. We took off with difficulty, an old aircraft. Mechanics had to work on it, on one engine, for 45 minutes before it would even start. I couldn't understand why this brand new airplane had been rejected for the mission of mercy. We delivered the ton of medicines, got back that evening about sunset, to discover that half an hour after we had taken off, in that old crate that wouldn't even climb above 5,000 feet, half an hour after we had taken off and had successfully completed our mission of mercy, the brand new Dove de Havilland had tried to take off and had crashed on takeoff, killing everyone in the aircraft. I'll never forget the sound of that angel's warning words. And how nice it is to know that wherever we go, whatever the circumstances, we can rely on the love of God as manifested through the ministration of these holy beings. Pastor Lamazani was one of our district leaders in what is today known as the Zaire, used to be the Congo. Last year we went past that district, that area, in a little trip visiting the churches, combined sort of with a working holiday vacation. We passed through the area where Pastor Lamazani had been the district on the particular occasion that I wish to mention to you. Pastor Lamazani was a faithful worker. I had tried to get in and visit him. I knew things were going very rough in that area. The fighting tribes, fighting for supremacy of the Congo, as well as backing, as I have mentioned, from outside forces arming certain tribes, other opposition forces assisting the other tribes. And so it was just one horrible situation of fighting back and forth between the tribes. It had been so severe that I was unable to get into the area where Pastor Lamazani was the district leader. He was in charge of two of our largest districts. I had gotten right to the border of his district. I remember the morning we got there, the only way we could get there was to travel in the company of armed mercenaries. Otherwise we would never have gotten as far as we did. We got to the border, the River Mungui, and as we stood there, before us the bridge had been blown up in the tribal fighting. We could not get across. It was only several weeks later that this story came out. Pastor Lamazani and his 4 children were living in the little village of Seya. He had been warned. Many of his Christians had fled into the jungle. At that particular time, the witch doctors had taken over the administration of those tribal areas in his particular region. Because of the fighting and the unsettled situation, the political leaders could not agree. Some of the political leaders joined in with the witch doctors. And because of the awesome fear in which and respect that the witch doctors were looked upon by the total population, the political leaders seemed to think, well, if they could join forces with the witch doctors, they might be able to succeed in establishing a semblance of order. And so these witch doctors had decreed that anyone who refused to bow down to their native idols, to sacrifice a chicken, anyone who still retained his respect of a religion that was brought by a white man, a religion whose white owners had been driven out of the country. Now the country was independent. Anyone who dared to call himself a Christian and to still hold on to this white man's religion would be killed. Orders had gone out. that from the witch doctors that they must revert to their old pagan ceremonies of worship. Lamazani knew this, our evangelist. Because of that, many of his Christians, as I say, had built little shelters back in the jungle, away from the main roads, where the witch doctors and their mobs or their killers would go through. So again, the warning came to Pastor Lamazani that he should leave that village, that he should go and join a group of 35 or 40 of his members that had gone way deep into the jungle. No, he still had another 70 or 80 in the village of Saya. He felt he could not go. Then, one evening, the report came that the witch doctors and their group, their mobs, were in the neighboring village, 4 or 5 kilometers away. Lamazani called his members. Some of them had come to him, asking for counsel, for guidance. What should they do? He had said anyone that felt that they should flee would be perfectly allowed, and at their own decision they should seek refuge in the jungle. But he said he felt that he could not. He would not. Oh, but your house will be destroyed. Our church will be burned. These very simple yet representative thatched roof churches that we have in that country would burn very easily. Being a dry, thatched roof, mud and pole walls. The house in which Pastor Lamazani lived was also of the same type of construction. Later on that evening, 2 of his other friends, not Christians, friends in the village, came to him and said, "We hear that the witch doctors are going to send someone to destroy this church and to destroy your home this evening. Tonight sometime. Please leave. Flee into the jungle. You should leave." Again, Pastor Lamazani said that he would pray about it. If he felt impressed to leave, he would do so. If not, he would remain. He called his wife and 4 children together. They prayed. They prayed often that night. About midnight, there was a hammering on his door. A vicious barking order from a man outside commanded him to open the door. "Open the door or we will burn down your house." Pastor Lamazani called his family together. Again, in the middle of their sitting room floor, they gathered and quoted some of these promises that are so precious to each one of us. The shouts increased outside. "We will give you one more chance to come out here, or we will destroy you in your home." As Pastor Lamazani prayed, he felt that he should remain inside. Soon the crackling of the dry, thatched roof could be heard. The choking smoke, the flames surrounded them. Just as the order had been given, they heard the order outside. "Set it alight." Then at the window off to the side, there was a hammering sound, and with axes, the window was chopped open. 2 of the soldiers from the witch doctor's camp were standing there. They could see Pastor Lamazani on his knees with his wife and children praying. They sneered. They threw one of the axes which slightly wounded the pastor on his leg as they threw it at him in the middle of the room. He continued to pray. The roof, the building, totally ignited. It was about 4 weeks later that I was able to get into that part of the country. And as I followed the little foot trail out into the jungle, about 8 miles out, to the little Adventist village that had been established in seclusion, as we entered that village, Pastor Lamazani came running to me, threw his arms around me. I had worked with him. I had known him as a boy. He and I grew up together. And as I looked at him, I could hardly recognize him as the neat, well representatively dressed man that I knew Pastor Lamazani to be. He was in tattered, the clothes that he possessed hadn't been able to be renewed for months because of the fighting. He looked a pathetic figure. But as he threw his arms around me, he told me that night, during the burning of his home, with those witch doctors and their fierce killers all around his house, his every belonging that he had other than what he had on him going up in smoke, he said, we were praying. And as we prayed, we saw two figures so much brighter than the flames that were destroying our home come in that open window and lifted us out of that room and brought us out here to the jungle. Ministering angels sent from our loving Father above, and everything was all right. The story that he told was very impressive. After the house had burnt down, the smoldering ashes, charred timbers, the witch doctor ordered that his men bring out the bodies, the 6 bodies of these who dared to defy his order. His men went in there. The 2 men who had watched through the window, they testified that they were right there in the middle of the room. Now a smoldering mass of half-burnt grass and jungle poles. They pulled the poles off. They dug away the ashes. They could find no bodies. No charred corpses were available to prove that they had been able to destroy this family that so defiantly trusted in an unseen God. 3 years after this experience, one of the witch doctors was converted because of that wonderful manifestation of the love of God through the ministration of angels. A few months after this particular experience, the name of Malisawa became a common word among the people of the Katanga. Last year we drove through the little village of Nyemba, which was the headquarters of Malisawa and his troops. This was one of the most outstanding examples of the love of God manifested in my life and in the life of my fellow workers that I have ever experienced. I want to share it with you briefly. It's a tremendous experience. I've told it before, but every time I think about it, every time I live through those moments which now, looking back on them, and at the time even, seem to drag out into an eternity. But throughout that whole experience, the wonderful ministry of those loving angels was a thrill every time I think of the experience. Malisawa was a bandit leader. He was a very outstanding leader. Malisawa was a common name. Many of the Africans had that name. And so when we heard the name Malisawa, we didn't think very much about it. I had known a number of Malisawas. But dear friends, the experience of Malisawa has affected my life so profoundly that I would like to tell you that this bandit, on whose life, on whose head the government had placed a reward of 5 million francs for anyone who could bring him in, dead or alive, the Lord overruled in this particular experience. The United Nations tried to go in and subdue him. He was a law unto himself. Although other tribes were being armed by the United Nations, his purpose was to destroy everything that he didn't care for. That included the United Nations. The United Nations sent in a contingent of Irish troops to try and trap this cunning bandit leader who had pillaged and followed an utter scorched earth policy in the northern part of the Katanga, robbing the other tribes who were not members of his tribe, looting, destroying, killing, to the extent that the government did everything in their power to destroy him. We had 2 mission stations up in the area that was controlled by the reign of terror of Malisawa. President Chombe, who was in charge of the Katanga at that time, was a close friend of mine, through the Minister of the Interior, Mr. Munongo, who had radio contact with his troops that were bordering the area where Malisawa was operating, had brought in messages that his troops had sent down to the Minister of Interior, who in turn relayed it to President Chombe, saying that the fighting was so severe, that medicines were so desperately needed. Who could go in? Who could relieve? The troops were asking for help. The residents, the villagers needed help. But under those conditions, no one seemed to be able to enter. Yes, this contingent of United Nations troops, of the Irish, went in there. The Irish and the famous Gurkha battalion from India were the 2 most feared groups that were fighting in the United Nations, and so the Irish were sent up there. Malisawa very easily disposed of them by setting a trap. Right in one of his jungle fastnesses, he dug a pit, a hole, a cavern, longer than the length of this worship hall, in the bottom of which he placed sharpened iron stakes, spears, and so carefully camouflaged by covering up this particular pit, he could not, nobody could detect that there was a trap there. All the earth had been carried away, covered up in the jungle, so that as the United Nations Land Rovers, jeeps, and military equipment came along, they had no idea they were all going to plunge into this big pit. Malisawa's troops were lining the jungle road, concealed behind dense undergrowth, as the United Nations troops piled in one on top of another in this large pit. His troops destroyed all but 2 who were able to escape and give the horrible story of what had happened. From these military supplies, Malisawa rearmed himself, his troops, so that they could continue their reign of terror. President Chombe called me once and asked me if I wouldn't please try to take some medicines up into that area. He knew it was difficult. He knew it was virtually impossible. He knew what had happened the previous month with the United Nations troops. But as we prayed about this, it was an assignment, a difficult assignment. These precious promises, for he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways, came to us and the little group of workers down in Elizabethville as we tried to decide whether to accept the challenge and the request from the president of the country. They shall bear thee up in their hands, lest thou dash thy foot against a stone. More promises of what the angels of God and this wonderful ministry would do. We felt we must try to relieve the desperate situation those folks were in up there. And so President Chombe gave me 3 or 4 aircraft which we loaded with various supplies, food, clothing, medicines. These supplies were flown up to the little town of Albertville on the west side of Lake Tanganyika, the closest point that we could get to the area that Malisawa was literally destroying. Then after these supplies, about 100 tons in total, had been flown up, then a convoy of 17 trucks and 2 or 3 Land Rover jeeps were sent up there to escort these supplies into the area so we could give some relief, not only to our dispensaries, our bush clinics, but to the total population. As I left Elizabethville, President Chombe said to me, "Friend, Be careful. Do not take any unnecessary risks. But God is with you. He told me to work closely with Colonel Kimwanga, who was his commander of that northern sector. As we got to Albertville, I had known and met Colonel Kimwanga. I knew him fairly well. He told me with a shake of his head, it's impossible for you to go into that area. All these supplies have arrived. We have stored them carefully, but at present it is impossible. Wait. I have some troops that are on the fringes of that area. They are reporting to me daily. 12 o'clock every day, they send me a report of the movements of Malisawa. The first day, the report was gloomy. The second day, no hope. The third day, likewise. It was on the fifth day, as Colonel Kimwanga and I sat there and listened to the incoming radio messages, the report was given that Malisawa and his band had moved to the south, that the main road from Albertville to the little village of Nyemba, through which we drove last year, and all these memories were so clearly brought to my mind again, that this main road had been was fairly comparatively safe. Colonel Kimwanga turned to me and said, "Friend, would you like to try tomorrow morning?" I said, yes, sir. We will go tomorrow morning. The convoy was loaded from the warehouses. There was a driver, a government driver that I had used previously, a young fellow by the name of Samson. He was a good Christian. He was a careful driver. And he just happened to be of the tribe of Malisawa. But as we set out that morning, I was in the Land Rover driven by Samson, whom I had requested to be my driver. Colonel Kimwanga had told us the first 50 kilometers will be the most dangerous. It's in the valley. And as we drove through that valley that day, I can remember the words of David so clearly, the valley of the shadow of death. It certainly was the valley of the shadow of death. In the roads were corpses that Malisawa's troops had destroyed as they attacked these villages that were not of their tribe. Along the sides of the road were stakes with women impaled on these stakes, gashed open, most hideous scenes that I had never expected my eyes would behold. As we proceeded farther into Malisawa's territory, the roads were so filled with dead bodies. We tried to stop. We tried to pull some of the bodies aside, but we could not. It would delay us reaching the point where we had to get that evening for any safety to our own convoy. So we just had to put those vehicles in four-wheel drive and grind over these corpses as we proceeded. We got out of that valley. Colonel Kimwanga had said, as you climb up the escarpment onto the high forested hills up above, you will be comparatively safe, out of the danger zone. What a prayer of thanksgiving we offered as we got up to the top of the escarpment. Samson and I prayed, thanked the Lord for his protection. We were up on top. We could hear those heavily loaded trucks coming up the escarpment. It would take them about half an hour in their heavily loaded condition to get up that grade, that very difficult grade. So we decided, Samson and I, that we would go on ahead and wait for them at another village which we knew about 14, 15 kilometers on ahead. We started along for the first time that morning with lighter hearts, doing a much better speed than we had been doing all day. It was high, level, flat plateau with clumps of dense jungle through which we had to pass. We were just going through one of these dense clumps of jungles when all of a sudden Samson grabbed the wheel of the Land Rover, jerked it to the left, over into the ditch, the drainage ditch that lines all of these tropical roads, And there we piled into the ditch, tipped over onto the side. There we were, hugging each other tightly, and I said to him, what's the trouble? What happened? Oh, we're going to die. We're going to die, Pastor. They're going to kill us. They're going to kill us. I said, what's the matter? Oh, I've seen Malisawa's sign of an ambush. I've seen his sign. Only to his tribesmen had he announced the sign of 3 white leaves, long, slender jungle leaves, which he would suspend over the road in a conspicuous place so that only members of his tribe would realize that ahead was an ambush. Another one of these huge, dismal pits into which we would plunge. There we were now, lying on our side, the wheel still spinning outside of that Land Rover, and poor Samson just terribly excited, not knowing what to say. He'd grab me. Oh, Pastor, pray, we're going to get killed. They will kill us. 2 minutes passed, 3, 4, maybe 5 minutes passed. Nothing happened. I tried to quieten him. I said, but Samson, everything is all right. Maybe this is an abandoned trap. Maybe this is something that used to be a dangerous spot, but Colonel Timwanga told us that Malisawa had moved to the south. Oh, no, the sign was very clear. This is a dangerous trap. Another few minutes passed. Almost breathlessly, Malisawa told me not to get out. I tried to start to get out, and with a little portable loudspeaker that we carried for food and clothing distribution in my hand, I tried to get out. No, he pulled me back on top of him again. No, he said, you must not get out. A few more minutes passed. Nothing happened. Everything was perfectly quiet. But then finally I opened the door, which I had to climb through with great difficulty. I got out, stood at the edge of the road, looked around. Just a tunnel through the jungle. I could see nothing suspicious. In the sand of the road, as I stepped into the road, I could see fresh tracks that men had been around there, indications that this was freshly created tracks there in the road. I had a very strange feeling, a feeling that I was being watched. I didn't quite know how to react. I had never been in such a circumstance before. As I stood at the edge of the road, I was impressed by the Spirit of God to say something. I put the little portable transistorized loudspeaker to my mouth, and I spoke in the language of that tribe in whose territory we were passing, which I had learned as a young fellow. I just said to the trees in the jungle around me, I said, we have come as friends. Totally unprepared speech, of course. I am pastor of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I am here to help you. Anybody in this area that needs help, we are here to help you. We are not here as enemies, but as friends. Nothing happened. Everything was quiet. Even the jungle monkeys that are so prevalent in those dense clumps of jungle, as I stepped out of the Land Rover, I had seen a troop of them off in the distance. The branches were moving. Even they were quiet. Everything was deathly quiet. And out of the quietness came a snap of 2 dry twigs. Snap, snap. It was the signal. A signal that I had learned as a boy. A challenging signal. A reply must be given. But the reply to this signal, I had forgotten. It was a challenging signal that I knew someone off in the jungle there was inquiring of me, without wishing to expose himself, whether I was truly a friend. If I could come up with the right word, everything would be all right. But it had been 12 or 14 years since I had remembered even and had even used that word. A word that was sort of a shibboleth, you remember the Bible? if you could give the right password, okay, you were a member of the tribe, you were trusted, you would be accepted and respected. I flashed a message on the frequency of heaven. Like another flash, that word came back to the tip of my tongue. Katubuke, I shouted. It was the right word. It was the tribal sign of friendship. Someone back in the dark jungle back there was challenging our passage. The Lord had given me the right word. Then I again put my loudspeaker, my little PA system to my mouth, and I said, friend, whoever you are out there, please come and let's shake hands. And I gave the respectful greeting in the local language that only the big chiefs are due to receive. Nothing happened. Everything for a minute or two was quiet as the tense situation even became tenser. And then off to my right, there was a little rustle in the jungle. The leaves moved, and onto the edge of the road I saw a tall, handsome, fine-looking warrior with an automatic rifle in his hand, pointed right at me. I said, friend, put down your gun, please. I have no weapons. I'm here as a friend. He continued, taking 2 or 3 steps toward me with that automatic rifle pointed right at me. As he came closer, I gave him the respectful greeting because I could see from bands of leopard skins around his arms, a stripe around his chest, that he was some tremendous leader. I gave him the respectful greeting. Again, I made the request, put down your gun. Let's greet each other as friends. He then obeyed, laid his gun along the stump of a jungle tree. He did not come in the road. He came off on the edge of the road toward me, suspiciously, cautiously. As he approached me and I approached him, I extended my hand in another respectful greeting. He looked at me, clasped my hand, and said, Pastor Robinson, what are you doing here? He had some war paint over his eyes, on his forehead. His cheeks were decorated with a red and white ochre. I couldn't recognize him. I said, do you know me? Yes. Yes, of course I know you. Don't you know me? I said, who are you? I am Malisawa. In my hand, I was holding 5 million francs, as it were. What a thrill. And this terribly feared bandit knew me. Don't you remember? I am Malisawa from the village of Lengwe. You used to teach us in your little branch Sabbath school 14, 15 years ago. I am the Malisawa. Don't you remember me, Pastor Robinson? Of course I remembered that Malisawa, but I had no idea that that Malisawa was now this feared bandit. As I held his hand, he began to tremble. Like a leaf in the wind, his whole body was shaking. He said, now I understand. Now I understand why, for the first time in my life, my voice disappeared. My voice was taken from me. I tried to give an order as that Land Rover went into the ditch for my men to kill. I couldn't find a voice. My voice was taken. And as I looked at the wheels spinning around on your Land Rover, I could see soldiers standing around, heavily armed. I could see these soldiers off in the road behind you. I didn't know. They didn't look like United Nations troops. Of course, they had murdered a bunch of them just a month before. I knew they were not United Nations troops. Now I understand. Those stories you used to tell us, those picture rolls of the Sabbath school that you used to show us, still he was trembling, of your God, of those angels that your God sends. Now I understand why I lost my voice, why I could not give the order to kill and to destroy. Now I understand those beings that looked like the moon and like the stars were angels from your God. Oh, Pastor Robinson, but what are you doing here? What a thrill. I told him what I was doing there. I could see that the Spirit of God, those mighty angels from heaven, were still standing right there beside us. For this terrible killer, this man skilled in the art of destruction and death, was still trembling. As I tried to hold his hand, we talked for 2 or 3 minutes. And then he heard the trucks approaching. He said to me, Pastor Robinson, are there troops? Are there government troops in those trucks that you are bringing? I said, yes, Malisawa, but they are under my control. They are under my orders. Oh, but they will kill me. He had heard, he knew that he had a terrible price on his head. I said, there will be no killing here today. God and his angels are here. There will be no killing today. The trucks were still 2 or 3 kilometers away, and I spoke to him. I said, friend, you have seen today a wonderful demonstration of God's love for you. If that God who sent those troops whom you saw, I did not see them, only one of them could have annihilated you and your men. But God loves you. That same Jesus that you heard about under the mango trees in the village of Lengwe 15 years ago is still speaking to you. He continued to tremble. I said, promise me, friend, promise me, Malisawa, that you will give up this life of destruction, that you will respect and honor the love of the Jesus who has saved your life, who is willing to give you eternal life with him. He hesitated. He looked around. I said, how many troops do you have with you in the jungle back there? I said, call them. Let's talk to them. Let me talk to them. He gave an order. 52 heavily armed bandits came out from both sides of that jungle. They couldn't understand what had happened to their proud and haughty leader, grasping the hand of a white man, one of the race that they were sworn to destroy. They looked at him, vicious, cruelty, death in their eyes. As they approached, Malisawa turned around to them. They said, this man's skin is white, but his heart is the same as ours. He is our friend. He is not a white man like the other white men you know. They gathered around him. He briefly told them about his voice having disappeared, about the soldiers from heaven who had come, and who I had assured him were still standing, watching over our meeting that day. I asked him again, I said, will you promise to give up this terrible life of destruction and slaughter that you have been following now for several years, in the presence of his men, who a few weeks later killed him? He promised. It took about 2 months for me to persuade the government of Chombe and his cabinet ministers that Malisawa was a converted man. They were only convinced when the horrible reign of terror that had lasted so long up in the northern part of the Katanga completely subsided, that another proclamation was given by President Chombe explaining briefly that Malisawa was now a Christian, and the 5 million francs on his head was no longer an offer. The radio Katanga blared this news. The newspapers carried it in headlines. But dear friends, as we think of the ministry of angels in our lives, it is as real as the person sitting beside you. And as we realize that these beings from our Father in heaven are continually by our side to help us as we battle against the forces of the evil one during these last few days of earth history, why should we ever get discouraged? God grant us each the victory that is assured, because our Father in heaven loves us and has sent his angels, and everything will be all right.